This is continuing on with our poetic literary devices. We are on part 5, poetic movement. And there are two basic parts. Our first term is rhythm, and this is the more general term for the pace and flow of a line of poetry. So any adjective you could use to describe a song could also be used to describe a poem in terms of rhythm. And poets create this by using different rhyming techniques, by thinking about which syllables are stressed or said more loudly, by thinking about how words fit together. But for example, you could have a slow, flowing sound because maybe they use a lot of long vowels. It can be quick and rapid. Usually this is brought on by rhyme, but you put maybe short vowels right next to each other, maybe short syllable words, so it kind of all lines up. It can be jagged if we don't have like a steady rhythm, if there isn't sort of any pattern and it cuts off in strange places. It can be stately if you read it slowly and it sounds really elegant. It can be sprightly if it's playful. So any kind of adjective you can think of can be used to describe rhythm. Now our more technical poetic term is meter, and all these red lines will make sense in a second. But our technical definition is the audible pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line of poetry. And by stressed, we just mean lines that are said slightly more loudly, and unstressed, they're said slightly more slowly. So in the English language and for native speakers, there are certain syllables you just naturally say with more stress than the others. Like, for example, the word syllable. You can kind of hear if you listen that the first syllable in syllable is said more loudly. Syllable versus syllable or syllable, right? And it sounds kind of strange if you have the stress on the wrong syllable. So in poetry, they figured out that there are different patterns people can follow as they're writing to create different effects. And there are 5 main patterns or feet that they use. The first is an iamb, and it's unstressed and then stressed, and we mark it with kind of a curvy line and then a straight kind of a straight almost accent mark. So away, the second syllable, is said more loudly. Trochee is the opposite. Garden, the first syllable is said more loudly, so it goes stressed, unstressed. A dactyl has 3 syllables to it, and it goes stressed, unstressed, unstressed. So poetry. Anapest is the opposite of that. It's 2 unstressed syllables and then stressed. Understand. And lastly, a spondy is 2 stressed syllables in a row. Dead set. You say both of those loudly. So in poetry, we get these patterns that repeat over and over within a line. And every time a pattern repeats, they think about it as a poetic foot. So lines, a poetic line is described by the number of feet or the number of repeated patterns of sound per line. So if I have 3 sets of this pattern, unstressed, stressed, 3 sets within a single line, then I would call it iambic trimeter, right? Because it's 3 feet within a single line and it's using iambs. So we use these names and they correlate with the number of patterns per line in order to come up with the way that we describe the lines. So to give you a couple examples, if I'm writing with trochees, and that's my pattern, garden, so it goes stressed and then unstressed. If I have 4 sets of these per line, then we'll be writing in trochaic tetrameter. So we have the type of pattern and then the number of times it repeats. So we could have anapestic hexameter, spondaic trimeter, right? It's just the combination of those 2. And our most common one is iambic pentameter, which of course is iamb, so unstressed and then stressed, and 5 of them in a line. So that would give us 10 syllables in a line, and this is the one that of course is used in the sonnet. If you want to look up more readings about meter, it will go into far more depth, But for the sake of this class and for our basic scansion purposes, just knowing kind of how it works and the names of the different stressed syllables will be enough. Other poetic terms that you should be familiar with. First, we have kind of these comparative words. So a metaphor is a direct comparison between two unlike things. So we don't have any kind of mediation, and we're describing two things that seem like they're not at all similar, but we have this comparison between them. So if I say your past is lava, we have to think, what about lava goes with someone's past, right? It's kind of these striking comparisons that make us think in ways that we maybe haven't before. Your smile is tree branches without their leaves. All of these are kind of negative things in our examples. And when we have a metaphor that goes for an entire poem, so it's spread out over and over, we call that a conceit. A simile is very similar. It's a comparison between two unlike things, but it uses like or as a way of kind of mediating. So his dog was like in ancient lute wailing, not his dog was in ancient lute wailing. So we get just a little bit of mediation with similes. They're very similar to each other, but metaphors are more direct. I'm going to use this poem to kind of explain the next few terms. So you may want to pause the video here and read it and think about what's happening. The speaker is the person that's saying the poem, and we don't want to assume that the poet is always speaking autobiographically, right? Because a woman could put herself in the place of a man, and the speaker could be male. Poets get pretty particular about this, that their poems don't have to be spoken from their perspective. It could be someone else. Now, we do have the confessional movement where people are famously wanting to be themselves in poems, but generally we always call it the speaker, especially when we're writing about it. So in this poem, our speaker is going to be the niece of Aunt Jennifer. It's from her perspective that everything's happening. She's watching Aunt Jennifer, and we know that she's the niece. Or I suppose it could be the nephew, but she's watching her aunt and commenting on the situation. And we know, for example, that Aunt Jennifer isn't the one that's saying the poem. Next, we have images or imagery, language used to convey a vivid sensory picture or description. Often these rely on the five senses. So in the poem, we have all kinds of images. We could say pacing in sleek chivalric certainty is something we can imagine seeing. Her fingers fluttering, we could say that that's kind of feel. The ivory needle is hard to pull. We can see the resistance. The wedding band sits heavily. So we get all of these different images, these things that we can imagine in a vivid way, all throughout the poem. Lots and lots of examples of images. We also could have symbolism, and it's something that makes sense in and of itself, but it stands for or represents something larger and more complex. So in this poem, we could say that Uncle's wedding band, as it sits heavily upon her hand, is a symbol of marriage, right? And the way that the relationship and the way that they're tied together legally and through their lives is kind of weighing on her. So it's a symbol for marriage, even though it could actually be a literal ring that's sitting on her finger. We could also say that the tigers that are described, that she's embroidering, could be symbolic of how she wants to be. They don't fear the men beneath the tree. They know their place. They're prancing. They'll go on forever, prancing, proud and unafraid. So the tigers could symbolize what Aunt Jennifer is kind of aspiring to here. And our very last term is a theme. And these are major ideas, principles, or subjects that a work explores or evokes. So our most obvious theme here is feminism, because we have women's rights all over the place. Aunt Jennifer seems kind of oppressed. She seems afraid of Uncle, right? But there are also some other themes. We could talk about, we could talk about kind of art and the role of art. As she's embroidering, we could look at what art is doing. She's creating what she aspires to. Her art is going to kind of outlive her in some way. Another theme could just be familial tensions. So tensions between spouses, but also between the niece as she's watching. We could say that that roles in the world is also kind of a theme. So it doesn't have to be the most overt thing. It can be an idea that kind of repeats or gets carried out in some way. And that concludes our lesson on poetic literary devices. Like I said, you're welcome to email the instructor to ask for more examples of any of these or ask for clarification. And feel free to use your notes or even the PowerPoint as you're taking the quiz. The idea is just to help you remember and familiarize yourself with all the sorts of literary devices that are often used in poetry.